When JD Vance stepped onto the stage of one of the most watched talk shows in America, the audience expected just another heated debate. That's when a young, ambitious host made the biggest mistake of her career, thinking she could corner and humiliate the senator with quick jabs and tech industry talking points. What she didn't realize was that JD wasn't just another politician. He was a man who had spent years cutting through the noise and exposing uncomfortable truths. And what happened next became a defining moment in the AI debate. Because in true JD Vance style, he didn't just respond, he took control. The studio lights burned bright, their cold glow reflecting off the sleek glass table in the center of the stage. The crowd murmured with anticipation, their eyes fixed on the empty chair across from the host's desk. The screens lining the walls flickered with the show's logo, The Progressive Hour with Laura Johnson, a name that had become synonymous with viral takedowns and headline-making interviews. Tonight promised to be no different. Laura Johnson, the show's sharp-tongued and fiercely ambitious host, sat poised, her practiced smile in place. Dressed in a tailored suit with just the right amount of edge, she was a rising star in the media world, a champion of Silicon Valley's vision for the future. She had built her brand on mocking so-called AI fearmongers, the politicians and commentators who dared to question whether automation, artificial intelligence, and corporate tech monopolies were truly good for the average American. And tonight, she had her latest target, Senator JD Vance. The former venture capitalist turned populist conservative had been one of the loudest voices warning about the dangers of unchecked AI, job displacement, national security risks, even the question of whether big tech should have so much influence over the government. Laura saw it as an opportunity, a chance to paint Vance as outdated, resistant to progress, another politician afraid of a future he didn't understand. The audience was stacked in her favor. Rows of tech entrepreneurs, AI researchers, and social media influencers filled the studio, eager to watch another conservative struggle to justify their skepticism of innovation. They had seen it before. Guests flustered, cornered, left speechless by Laura's sharp, rapid-fire questions. JD Vance was just another name to add to the list. Backstage, producers moved in a coordinated dance, checking mics, adjusting lights. The show's assistant director gave the countdown. 5, 4, 3. The music cue hit. The show's intro flashed across the screen. Laura turned to the camera, smiling with effortless charm. "Good evening, everyone," she said smoothly. "Tonight, we have a very special guest, Senator JD Vance, who has quite a few concerns about AI. But are his fears justified? Or is he just another politician afraid of change?" The audience chuckled knowingly. It was time for the main event. The applause was polite but measured, a formality rather than genuine excitement. The studio doors opened, and JD Vance walked onto the set. No entourage, no flashy suit, just a man in a simple navy blazer and an unshaken expression, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been underestimated before. Laura extended her hand, her smile tight, but professional. JD shook it firmly, his grip steady, his eyes unreadable. The audience clapped again, but there was an undercurrent of expectation, tension disguised as civility. They weren't here to be won over. They were here to watch him stumble, to witness the inevitable moment when he would fumble an argument and Laura would tear it apart, piece by piece. JD sat down, adjusting his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. Laura wasted no time. "Senator, welcome to the Progressive Hour." Her voice was warm, but there was a subtle sharpness beneath it, the same tone a cat might use before playing with a mouse. JD nodded, "Glad to be here." His voice was even, calm, unmoved. Laura glanced down at her notes, her posture shifting slightly, a silent signal to the audience that the real game was about to begin. "Now, let's start with the obvious," she said, leaning forward. "You've been very vocal about your concerns with AI. saying it threatens American jobs and even our national security. But let's be honest, hasn't every major technological advancement sparked fear at first? People were scared of automation, of the internet, and yet, here we are. Isn't AI just the next step forward? The audience chuckled approvingly, sensing where this was going. JD just tilted his head slightly, studying her. He didn't rush to answer, he didn't fidget. He simply let the question hang in the air just long enough to shift the energy in the room. The audience quieted. Laura's eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, as she realized something. JD Vance wasn't nervous, and that meant he was dangerous. Laura adjusted in her seat, flashing that practiced, polished smile she had perfected over years in the industry. She had done this before, set up a guest for an easy fall, made their views seem outdated, and walked away with another viral clip under her belt. Tonight would be no different. She chuckled lightly, shaking her head as she glanced at her notes. "Senator Vance," she began, "I have to say, listening to your concerns about AI, it feels like I've stepped into a 90s sci-fi movie." The audience laughed, sensing exactly where she was going. JD didn't flinch. Laura continued, her voice smooth, measured, just condescending enough to land the first jab without seeming overtly hostile. "You've been very vocal about your belief that AI is going to displace American jobs, even calling it a threat to national security. But come on, isn't that just fear-mongering?" A soft ripple of chuckles spread through the audience. Laura leaned in slightly, her confidence growing. Every time there's a new wave of innovation, people panic. Remember the Industrial Revolution? Remember automation, the internet? Every single time, someone claimed that jobs would disappear. And yet, she gestured around the stage as if presenting herself as living proof. We're still here. The economy didn't collapse. In fact, it got better. The audience nodded along, murmuring in agreement. JD sat still, his expression unreadable. No reaction, no shift in posture, just quiet, deliberate patience. Laura glanced toward the crowd, feeling the energy swing in her favor. "So, Senator," she said, tilting her head with that signature look of feigned curiosity, "what makes AI any different? Or are you just looking for something new to be afraid of?" Laughter. The setup was complete. All JD had to do was react, flinch, hesitate, get defensive, and she would pounce. But instead, he did what no one in the room expected. He simply sat there, watching, waiting, letting the weight of the moment shift, ever so slightly, back toward him. The audience quieted. Laura's confident smirk faltered just a fraction of an inch. And JD Vance, calm and collected, finally opened his mouth to speak. JD's voice was low, steady, and deliberate. "Laura, let me ask you something." She blinked. The tone of the conversation had shifted, and she could feel it. JD leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together, speaking slowly, not as a man scrambling to defend himself, but as someone about to turn the tables. "You bring up history," he said, nodding slightly. "Factories, automation, the internet." Laura nodded enthusiastically, sensing an easy rebuttal. "And you're right," JD continued. "Every one of those changes sparked fear at first. But tell me something, Laura." He paused, and in that brief moment, the audience leaned in. "Who benefited?" Silence. Laura blinked. "Well," she said quickly, "society as a whole. More efficiency, more productivity, better wages." "Did it?" JD cut in, his tone still calm, almost too calm. Laura stiffened slightly. The rhythm had changed. "Because if you ask the factory worker in a small Ohio town whose job got sent overseas after automation, he might tell you a different story," JD said, his eyes locked onto Laura's. "If you ask the coal miner whose entire town collapsed when progress decided he wasn't needed anymore, he might not be as optimistic." A hush fell over the audience. Laura wasn't laughing now. "Look at what happened after the internet boom," JD continued, his voice never rising, but somehow commanding more attention than Laura's entire monologue. Did it make jobs? Sure, but who got them? Tech billionaires in Silicon Valley? The audience shifted uncomfortably. JD tilted his head slightly. He wasn't done. AI isn't just the next step forward, it's control. Control over industries, control over speech, control over the very nature of work itself. Laura quickly tried to jump in, sensing she needed to take back control. "But Senator," she said, forcing a light laugh, "you're making it sound like AI is some kind of doomsday machine. The reality is, it's just another tool, one that will make life easier for everyone." JD smiled, and that's when she knew she had walked into his trap. JD let the silence breathe. He didn't rush, he didn't react. Instead, he simply sat there, letting Laura's words settle in the air like a cloud of smoke, thin, fleeting, and about to be blown away. Then, finally, he spoke. "Laura, tell me something," he said, his voice even, deliberate. "When factories automated, who benefited?" Laura blinked. It was the first time he had taken control of the conversation. She raised an eyebrow, her response already loaded. "Everyone did," she said confidently. "More efficiency, more products, better wages over time." JD nodded, not in agreement, but in quiet recognition of how predictable her answer was. "That's the theory," he said, his tone never shifting. "Now let's talk about reality." He turned slightly, his eyes scanning the audience, not as a politician looking for applause, but as a man speaking directly to those who understood. In reality, small towns lost entire industries. Generations of skilled workers were left behind, and many of them, he paused, looking back at Laura, never recovered. The energy in the room shifted. It wasn't a dramatic shift, not yet, but something subtle, a murmur in the crowd. A few people exchanged glances. Some nodded, some shifted in their seats. Laura's smirk faded just a fraction of an inch. JD leaned forward slightly. "You say it's progress," he continued, "but tell that to the laid-off truck driver who spent 20 years on the road and now gets told to learn coding." A quiet chuckle rippled through the audience, not laughter at him, but at the absurdity of the idea itself. Laura quickly regained her composure. She wasn't losing, not yet. She had one last chance to steer the conversation back on track. But JD, he wasn't done yet. Laura could feel the shift. It wasn't just a shift in the audience, it was a shift in momentum, and she had to take it back. "That's just a temporary adjustment," she said, her voice controlled, but with a slightly sharper edge than before. I will create new industries, just like every technological advancement before it." The audience clapped, sensing their cue. JD? He didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, he went deeper. "And who controls those industries?" he asked. Laura's eyes flickered, just for a second. JD leaned back slightly, his signature sign that he wasn't defending his position anymore. He was taking the offense. "Because it's not the American worker," he continued. "It's not the factory worker in Ohio. It's not the rancher in Texas. It's not the guy who just lost his job to an algorithm." He paused, just long enough for the weight of his words to sink in. "It's big tech." A ripple of discomfort spread through the audience. "The same companies," JD continued, his voice slow, methodical, deliberate, "that offshore jobs, that crush small businesses, that shut down competition." He turned toward Laura, his eyes locked on hers. "And you want me to believe," he said, "that these same companies suddenly care about the working class?" A few people in the audience nodded, hesitated, looked at each other. The energy in the room was changing. Laura could feel it. She was losing control. And the worst part? JD wasn't even trying to win. He was just telling the truth. And the audience knew it. Laura could feel the room slipping. Her carefully structured argument was crumbling. The confidence she had exuded at the beginning of the interview was beginning to feel forced, and she knew it. She needed to pivot, fast. With a subtle shift in posture, she adjusted her approach. Economics wasn't working. Fine. time to hit a different angle. "All right, Senator," she said, feigning a casual chuckle. "Let's talk about something more pressing." She glanced at the audience, bringing them into the conversation with a knowing look. "We can argue all day about whether AI is good or bad for jobs, but what about national security?" A ripple of approval spread through the audience. This was something they could get behind. Laura continued, her voice laced with righteous urgency. "The United States is competing with China, with Russia, nations that have no problem pushing AI to its absolute limits. Do you really think the answer is to hold ourselves back while they surge ahead?" Scattered applause. She leaned forward, locking eyes with JD. "AI in defense gives us an edge. It protects our country. Isn't it dangerous to fall behind?" JD smiled, and that's when she knew she had made a mistake, because he wasn't surprised by the question. He was waiting for it. JD nodded slowly, as if contemplating her words. Then, in the same steady voice he had used all night, he said, "So you're admitting AI isn't neutral?" Laura's smile froze just slightly. The audience murmured. That wasn't the response they expected. JD leaned back, arms folded casually. "You just admitted that AI is a weapon." Laura opened her mouth to interject, but JD kept going. "And yet," he said, "who's controlling it?" Silence. JD gestured with one hand. Not Congress, not the American people, not even our military. He let the question hang for a beat. "We're letting Silicon Valley billionaires, not elected officials, decide how it's used." The murmurs grew louder now. JD tilted his head slightly. "Do you trust them?" Laura blinked. "Well, because I don't," JD cut in, and now neither did half the audience. Laura knew what was happening. She had spent years shaping the narrative, guiding conversations, ensuring her guests played defense while she dictated the terms. But now she was scrambling. Her own audience wasn't sure who to root for anymore, and JD wasn't even sweating. Fine. She took a breath, straightened her back, and went for one last strike. "Okay, Senator," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "You're making it sound like AI is this unstoppable monster." She laughed lightly, forcefully. "But you can't stop AI," she said, shaking her head as if stating the obvious. "Trying to regulate it is like trying to stop the internet in the 90s. She glanced at the audience, searching for agreement. "You're just resisting progress." There it was. That was supposed to be her mic drop moment. The line that framed JD as a backward, outdated politician, terrified of the future. She waited for him to scramble, to defend himself, to fall into the trap. Instead, JD chuckled, not a laugh, not a nervous deflection, a low, knowing chuckle. And that's when Laura felt it, that sinking realization that she had just walked into his. JD tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked onto hers. "Progress for whom?" Laura blinked. For everyone," she said, a little too quickly, her voice just a little too high. JD didn't blink, didn't move. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, just enough to own the space between them. "Tell that to the American factory worker replaced by an AI-powered assembly line." Silence. "Tell that to the journalist replaced by ChatGPT." A few gasps. Someone in the audience murmured in agreement. "Tell that to your own interns when your job is automated." Boom! The audience erupted. Applause, gasps, murmurs, shock. Even some of Laura's own fans were nodding. Laura sat frozen for just a second too long. That was it. The moment had slipped away from her. And JD? He just sat back, arms crossed, watching her try to find a way back. Because she wouldn't. She had already lost. Laura could feel it now. The ground beneath her wasn't just shaking, it was crumbling. The audience wasn't fully with her anymore. The laughter that once followed her jabs, gone. The approving nods, fading. JD Vance had done something no one had expected. He hadn't played defense. He had let her swing, let her talk, let her control the pacing, and then he had ripped the rug right out from under her. She had one last shot. She took a breath, forced a confident smile, and pivoted to the classic argument. "Look, JD," she said, her voice casual, controlled, too controlled. "This is inevitable. AI is coming whether we like it or not. You sound like someone fighting against the tide." She leaned back in her chair, arms folded. It was supposed to sound like a winning statement. Inevitable, a force of nature, a future so unstoppable that only a fool would resist it. The audience waited for JD to respond. And then he paused just for a second too long, a second too powerful. JD let the tension stretch, let the moment swell, let the silence press down on the room like a weight. Then he leaned forward, just slightly, just enough. And with a quiet, deliberate voice that cut through the air like a blade, he said, "Funny, the people saying AI is inevitable are the same ones selling it." Boom. The audience erupted, not just applause, not just cheers, a standing ovation. Some clapped because they had seen it coming, some clapped because they hadn't. Some sat there stunned, realizing, maybe for the first time, what he was really saying. "Laura?" She sat frozen, her mouth opened slightly, as if searching for a response. But there wasn't one. Because JD hadn't argued, he hadn't debated, he had simply told the truth, and the room knew it. It didn't take long. Within hours, clips of the moment were everywhere. Trending #1 on Twitter, JD Vance clapback. YouTube was flooded with videos. JD Vance schools tech elites on AI dangers. Progressive host humiliated after trying to defend AI takeover. JD Vance just exposed the truth about Silicon Valley's AI agenda. The comments? A war zone. Some praised JD, calling it a defining moment in the AI debate. Others rushed to defend Laura, claiming she had been ambushed, outmatched, unfairly targeted. Mainstream media outlets scrambled to control the narrative. Some headlines framed JD as a hero. JD Vance calls out Silicon Valley's power, and he's right. Others tried to spin it. JD Vance's AI fear-mongering goes viral. Why he's wrong. But it didn't matter, because the internet had already decided. And JD? He said nothing. No follow-up tweet, no victory lap, no gloating. Because he didn't need to. He had let Laura talk, let the crowd react. And when the time came, he had ended it in one sentence. Because this was never about progress. It was about power. And JD Vance had just made sure the world noticed. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.